I see a lot of familiar faces here, so it's so good to see my colleagues and some of my former students here. Thank you for coming. And today I invited two colleagues to join me. One colleague is Sta Liu. This is a sociology professor at University of Toronto. This semester, Sta Liu is on leave, and currently he's a visiting scholar in Hong Kong at the University of Hong Kong. Because of the time differences, he couldn't really join us either remotely or physically. So what we managed to do is he made a video for me, and he emailed me this video all the way from Hong Kong to New York City. So first we will watch this video, and here's the other colleague I invited, Professor Margaret Borton. And in the middle of the semester, I reached out to her out of blue saying, hey, Margaret, would you like to visit us in New York City and be my discussant at John Jay? And she said yes. So here is Margaret. Margaret, I should note, is a lawyer and also a political scientist. Both Margaret and I study law and society in China. We both pay a lot of attention to gender inequality, so I figured she would be the best person for this task. And here is the arrangement. First, we will watch a short video, and then Margaret and I will start some exchanges. She asks questions, I respond, and towards the end, we will make sure there will be 30 minutes. We open the floor, so there will be questions, comments from people in the room or in the Zoom meeting. So that's the setup. So far, so good? Okay, so shall we watch the video clip first, and we'll start in the video.
Hello, it's my great pleasure to have the opportunity to say a few words about Professor Li Ke's new book, Marriage Unbound. I've known Professor Li for more than 15 years now. When I first got to know Professor Li was the time both of us were in graduate school. She was just started to plan for this book. And of course, I'm sure she didn't expect it would take her 15 years to finish the entire project and publish the book. First of all, I want to say the book is really a stunning achievement in the sense that if you look around, I think it's a unfortunate development that I think many books in social sciences that we have, no matter in political science, sociology, anthropology, or law, have become more and more like fast food. And of course, there's a reason. There are many reasons for that. One of the reasons is that many students these days, they spend a lot more time watching videos, listen to podcasts rather than reading books. And at the same time, many academic books have become fast food in the sense that they you can pretty much read the introduction and know what the book was talking about. And sometimes people even put a few articles together as a book. But I think this book, Marriage Unbound, is very different. I recently wrote a review of this book. In my review, I call this book a fine cuisine, in contrast to all those fast food books that we often see in today's social sciences, because you can really see the 15 years of research and effort that our author put into the book from almost every page. Every page is valuable, is worth reading. And I want to make two points about the contribution of the book. One methodologically, and the other one theoretically. Methodologically, of course, the main research method that Professor Li used in this book is ethnography, right? She did altogether across 5 years of ethnographic work in a rural county in Sichuan province in Western China. And she closely observed the work of the legal workers who represent the women who go through divorce cases, right? So, and it's, the ethnography itself is probably the most, one of the most impressive ethnographic work in any law and society scholarship in recent years, not just the law and society scholarship on China, but I think globally, right? But I also want to point out that methodologically, Professor Li didn't stop at the ethnography. And she actually also spent almost an equal amount of time doing archival research and looking back into the history of administration of justice in China, civil justice in China, and also, of course, cases related to family and divorce, all the way back to the 1940s. From the founding moment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, all the way to the present, almost 7 decades of legal history, right? So if you read the book, you can see she almost seamlessly put the two methods together. So in almost every chapter, she combined historical data, quantitative data, across 7 decades with fine-grained, in-depth ethnographic stories from her fieldwork, right? So this is a rare combination, and also I think it makes the book both has the breadth and the depth of a first-class social legal scholarship. So that's the methodology. But theoretically, I also want to point out that I think the book is probably the most ambitious social legal studies on divorce topics in China, because for those of you who are not aware of this, in the past 2 years, there are actually 3 books on divorce in China actually published by different presses. One of them was written by my Hong Kong colleague, Professor He Xin, and the other one was written by Professor Ethan Michelson at Indiana University. And Professor Li Ke's book is the 3rd book on the same topic, divorce in China. But I think Marriage Unbound is the most ambitious and probably the most successful among all the 3 books. Why? Because theoretically, it actually really tries to go beyond the empirical case of divorce and and also marriage and women's experience in China, and how they experience all kinds of discrimination and inequality in litigation. That story is have already been told many times. But Professor Li really tries to use the case to make 2 theoretical contributions, both of which I think are quite substantial and important. The first contribution is really on the law and society scholarship on dispute resolution. And so Professor Li proposed a typology of 3 different types of power, including not just the power for judges to decide on cases, but also the power of judges in setting an agenda for divorce disputes or legal disputes more generally, and also the power of judges inform the consciousness, help form the consciousness of the individual citizens, especially in this case, Chinese women who go through divorce cases, right? So in other words, the agenda setting power and the conscious formation power that, as Professor Li called them in the book, are almost as important, I think, for understanding dispute resolution, not just in China, but also in other places, as important as the kind of the power to decide on particular cases in the judicial decision making. So I think that itself is an important contribution for the law and society scholarship, our understanding of dispute resolution. And the second theoretical contribution is more a contribution to the scholarship on, of course, Chinese politics, but more generally comparative politics in terms of what people in this scholarship usually call authoritarian legality. Here, I think Professor Li is making a very interesting cultural argument to authoritarian legality, because most people writing about authoritarian legality in China, in Russia, or other contexts really see authoritarian legality in a functional term, in the sense of how the legal system or the legal profession or the courts, what kind of functions they play in the legal system in legitimizing and justifying authoritarian regime, right? But Professor Li is taking a slightly different approach. She argues that these practices that actually constitute a divorce litigation in China is really constitute a cultural repertoire of statecraft. In other words, we have to understand the cultural aspect of how the Chinese state using the court, using litigation to actually manage something much bigger, about kind of how Chinese society is organized, how marriage, family, all these basic units of Chinese social life is organized. And really also, I think this cultural approach enable us to see authoritarian legality, not in terms of how what kind of functions they serve or how that support the regime or not support regime, but really see authoritarian legality in a much more pragmatic manner of seeing that as changing in planned and also unintended ways, over 7 decades of the history of the People's Republic of China. So I think that argument makes the book, I think, also of great interest to not just China scholars or law society scholars, but also to political scientists and social scientists more generally. So altogether, I really enjoy reading the book. I highly recommend all of you to read the book, not just the introduction, but actually the whole book, because as I said, it's a rare fine cuisine in this world of fast food books that we live in. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm afraid Professor Liu has set the expectation so high. Now I would have to try very hard not to disappoint colleagues and students. So can you hear me? Okay, I just want to make sure folks in the Zoom meeting can hear. So shall we start the conversation?
Let's start. Lika is not going to disappoint. I know that. I wanted to thank Lika for inviting me here and for John Jay also for having me. It's really it's a true pleasure. I'm here because I love the book and I want to be part of celebrating it. I'm going to plunge quickly into questions. Sudha, I think, did a lovely introduction. And I do want to reiterate, I think what I view his key takeaway here is I really do urge you to read it because you'll get a glimpse of it through our conversation today. But it's not an exaggeration to say that every page has a combination of just fascinating descriptive information tied to rural poverty, gender inequality, and divorce in China, and it's combined with the theoretical insights that we'll talk a little bit more about shortly. And then lastly, it's beautifully written, so it's just a pleasure to read and more than worth your time. So an amazing achievement. And I want to start out, Ke, by asking you to tell us more about why it's important for people who care about law and politics in contemporary China to think about divorce in rural China. And I recognize this is an unfair question because you have written 250 pages answering that question. But for the audience members who have not read the book, if you can touch on a couple of those key takeaways.
Sure. So in everyday life, we tend to believe divorce is a private matter between two individuals and their families. And in Marriage Unbound, I challenge this view by arguing divorce entails so much more than the dissolution of marriage between a husband and wife. Taking divorce as a strategic research site, I tackle several phenomena of great importance to sociologists, political scientists, social legal researchers, and China scholars. First, to my colleagues in the sociology of family, Marriage Unbound presents a meticulous study of how decades of massive rural to urban migration have reshaped Chinese family and marriage. So in the past 4 decades, more than 288 rural residents have become migrant workers known as China's floating population. Women over time have consistently made up 1/3 of this population, which is to say approximately 95 million Chinese women have joined the journey from the countryside to various urban destinations. As more rural women join the urban labor force, divorce rates have surged in China. Here I will use a few numbers to illustrate this trend. In the year of 1978, that was the beginning of the reform era, there was 0.2 divorce for every 1,000 Chinese. By the end of 2018, the rate had steadily climbed up to 3.2. And I should note, in the same year, the rate in the United States was 2.9. So statistically speaking, Chinese marriage today is probably more vulnerable, more fragile than the American counterpart. And it's against this backdrop, I examine the linkage between labor migration and marital instability in rural China. Using interview findings, I show how rural women themselves connect the dots between participation in labor migration and marital troubles in everyday life. In this way, Marriage Unbound provides a thoughtful response to two bodies of literatures. One, throughout most of 20th century, sociologists, demographers, and columnists largely treated women's increasing labor force participation as an economical phenomenon with implications manifest in the workplace, in the labor market, but very few researchers explicitly ask women, how do you see your own participation in the labor force? What meanings do you attach to such experiences? And similarly, when anthropologists, sociologists, and geographers began studying Chinese women's experiences in internal migration, at the turn of the 21st century, very few looked beyond factory floors, assembly lines, or large dormitories to consider migrant workers' challenges in domestic lives. Marriage Unbound, by showing how women themselves interpret the connections between labor migration and marital instability, I hope the book fills the gap in the literature. Secondly, for political scientists and sociologists, Marriage Unbound features a detailed analysis of the interplay of law and politics in an authoritarian context. Using various archival records, I show that throughout the history of the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, women and men unhappy about their marriages did not always go to the court to seek out judicial remedies. Instead, wives and husbands in the Maoist era, in the socialist period, and then in the 21st century, have developed drastically different experiences in dispute resolution and in political participation. More specifically speaking, in the Maoist era, the PRC's ruling elites mainly deployed mass campaigns, basically top-down, large-scale political movements as a dominant mode of state intervention in society and in citizens' intimate lives. In the socialist era, mass campaigns gave way to people's mediation, also known as 人民调解. And 人民调解, compared to political movement, it was more scattered, routinized, conducted by people's mediators. And these were individuals with very little legal training, usually party cadres embedded in schools, workplace, and in residential areas. Then, a decade into the 21st century, top decision makers have arrived at a novel realization. The PRC must institute a multi-pronged system comprising litigation, arbitration, people's mediation, letters, and visits, also known as 信访 in Chinese, and other official measures. All these measures serve to dispel popular contention, preempt social unrest, and safeguard citizens' rights in some but not in other domains. In the interest of time, I won't get into the details about mass campaigns in the Maoist era or the people's mediation in the socialist period. I can talk more during the Q&A. Here, let me just highlight the key takeaways. The fact that the PRC has increasingly relied on litigation to address citizens' marital grievances and rights claims, I argue, should not be treated as evidence indicative of an authoritarian regime's turn toward law. Similarly, ruling elites' efforts to shore up extra-legal or quasi-judicial or extrajudicial measures, such as people's mediation, should not be viewed as proof suggestive of the regime's turn against law. In other words, the PRC in recent decades did not turn toward or against law categorically, as some of my colleagues in China studies have contended. So this is where me engaging my colleagues in China studies. Rather, I argue the PRC has been weaving legality into the fabric of governance by juxtaposing it with, not pitting it against, extra-legal practices, institutions, and ruling methods. In recent years, policymakers at the top have consolidated judicial, quasi-judicial, and extrajudicial institutions by and large in hopes that they can deploy these institutions to solve different popular grievances. In this manner, it is in this sense I argue that the PRC in the 21st century has established a multi-pronged system for dispute resolution. In short, if we want to understand why these days Chinese women, compared to their mothers and grandmothers, are much more likely to land in court battles over divorce, we must restore the historical processes through which the Chinese state has remodeled its penetration into society and in turn readjusted its interventions in citizens' intimate lives. Finally, I also try to engage social legal scholars, and I do so by presenting a serious attempt to unravel inequality and power. Drawing on both archival and ethnographic data, I show how poorly female litigants, compared to their male counterparts, fared in the grassroots court system. The vast majority of the women in my book, when they walked away from their divorce suits, they barely get any conjugal property or child support. Those who suffered from domestic violence, spousal abandonment, even marital rape, could hardly get any judicial remedies. By sharp contrast, their husband managed to hold on to child custody and conjugal property. Those responsible for domestic violence, spousal abandonment, almost invariably remain unscathed from their encounter with the law. So in short, litigation produced enormous gender inequality. And I don't think these findings are unique to rural China. So social legal researchers have long recognized, rather than the weapon of the weak, legal mobilization and litigation can wind up perpetuating and exacerbating pre-existing injustice and inequalities. Thus, it is incumbent on us, we social legal researchers, to not only capture, not only document unequal legal outcomes, but to provide clear explanations for the underlying mechanisms responsible for such social production. To this end, I proposed a power-centered framework. I think Liu Sida briefly mentioned the three key concepts: agenda setting power, formal in decision-making power, and conscious formation power. Here, I won't get into the conceptual details. I just want to quickly argue that by placing both state and professional power front and center, I flash out exactly how litigation gave rise to inequality within and outside Chinese courts. So ultimately, this is what I try to do in this book. I want to elevate the intellectual significance of divorce. I want to invite people to look at divorce in a whole new light. And I hope I have achieved that by showing how women's legal mobilization and rights contention can forge new ground for our understanding of law, politics, and inequality in authoritarian context. I know it's a long answer, and I wish I could squeeze all this in 15 minutes.
Thank you. So I view that as, and that was the first question I asked, it's why should we, those of us interested in law and politics in China, and beyond, why we should care about divorce in the country. And so now I want to pose a second variation on that question, and it's tied to a quote you have in chapter 5. You cite historian Nancy Cott who says, no modern sovereigns can ignore the institution of marriage because marital practices underlie national belonging and the cohesion of the state. And then you go on, you build off of this to argue that, and here again I'm quoting, no modern judiciaries can ignore divorce, and Chinese courts are no exception. So my follow-up on the first question is then inviting you to help us understand why it is that the Chinese state cares so much about divorce.
Yeah, so it took me years to realize how deeply the state have entangled itself with ordinary Chinese intimate lives. In fact, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, has had a long-standing interest in controlling the marriage and family life of ordinary people. To understand this, I think it's necessary to examine the PRC's history and governing ideology as early as 1931, long before the Chinese Communist Party seized power on a national stage. The party promulgated, established formal rules and norms to regulate villagers' marital practices. And soon after, it founded the People's Republic of China. The PRC promulgated the first law, and it was the 1950 marriage law. And so this is to say, when you think about it, for a whole new, for a very nascent regime, the very first thing that occupied lawmakers' mind was not tax, was not, national security, it was the marriage law, and it was no coincidence. I would say that over time, party leadership has gained rich experiences in using the marriage as a means to advance its military, political, and economical objectives. So historically speaking, the institution of marriage has long been tied to the PRC's rule. Ideologically speaking, a line of political thinking which projects a correlative relation between the family and the state, which ties the integrity of matrimony to the cohesion of the nation, this political thinking has remained its currency among the PRC's top decision makers. For example, Xi Jinping has constantly talked about the significance of Chinese family. 2 years ago, the Central Institute of Party History and Literature, I know it's an awkward name, it's basically party organ, creating official history of the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese term is 中共中央党史文献研究院. So this party organ published a book, and this book collected all the instances in which Xi Jinping touched on the Chinese family. And this publication gives you a sense of to what extent party leadership tries to valorize the ideological significance of the family. So both historically and ideologically speaking, the institution of marriage carries a lot of weight. But I also want to point out a very practical aspect of why these days party leadership puts so much emphasis on the family, the integrity of marriage. In recent years, China has seen serious demographic crisis. One example is the Chinese population has been aging very rapidly. Two estimates speaks to the magnitude of the problem. In 2011, Chinese aged 65 and older made up roughly 8% of the total population, and that translates to 111 million people. And the estimation right now is that by the year of 2050, people aged 65 and older will make up 27% of the Chinese population, and we're talking about 400 million people. So the first problem is, just like Japan, South Korea, and other Eastern Asian societies, we've seen this rapid aging. And another problem is birth rates have been dropping to the lowest. Just a few weeks ago, on everyone's lips was the news that for the first time in 7 decades, Chinese population has been shrinking. And this trend is not going to reverse very soon because I think demographers have reached this consensus. And this is precisely why around 2015, the Chinese government relaxed the one-child policy. After that, couples could have 2 children, and I believe it was in 2021. They changed the policy again. Now you can have 3. But the point is, the population is aging, and it's not reproducing itself in a pace needed for the Chinese economy and needed for the Chinese government to boost its performance or legitimacy. All in all, this is to say that marriage becomes so important for the state to control the population. And in the epilogue of the book, I review the most recent round of reform in the Chinese judiciary. Since 2016, the country's highest court, the Supreme People's Court, has been ushered in a new round of reform, also known as a reform of family trials, 家事审判改革. To place the initiative into perspective, the Supreme People's Court emphasized that, quote, resolving marital disputes was not just a matter concerning the happiness of individuals and household. Instead, it is tied to the stability and the harmony of a society and the advancement of a civilization, unquote. One noticeable change in this reform was that the Supreme People's Court made divorce even harder. And I should quickly note that since 2003, 2004, divorce approval rates in Chinese court have been declining consistently. After 2015, approval rates for the first time dropped below 50%. So this means that for every 2 cases, divorce petitions inside Chinese courts, judges will throw out 1 case. Judges would ask you, go away, we're not going to grant you a divorce. So that's what it means. And then after 2018, the highest court made divorce even harder by formally introducing something called cooling off period for divorce, meaning that you have to wait longer to finalize your dissolution of marriage. And 2 years later, the country's highest legislature, the People's Congress, followed suit by writing cooling off period into the new civil code. Practically, this means that starting on January 1st, 2021, all divorcing couples must wait longer. It doesn't matter if they go to the court to contest their divorces or they go to local governments to register uncontested divorces. And I should quickly clarify, in China, there are 2 routes. If you're divorced, you and your spouse agree on all the terms, you can simply register your divorce agreements at a local government, usually at the Bureau of Civil Affairs. On the other hand, if you 2 couldn't agree on all the terms, then you can go to a court and ask a judge to adjudicate. But right now, it doesn't matter which route you pick, you would have to wait longer. So this just gives you a sense of how the Chinese state is limiting or restricting citizens' access to divorce. And I think this is the take-home message. Marriage was and will continue to serve as a key vehicle ruling elites deploy to advance their political, economical, and demographic agendas. Thus, the tension between individual freedoms and state control over intimate lives will persist, with the judiciary caught in the middle. In the years to come, judges will continue to struggle in their efforts to balance responsibility to protect citizens' lawful rights in divorce and political imperatives to uphold the PRC's vision of marriage as a cornerstone of national unity.
Thanks. You really brought to life the reality of what the cooling off period means in practice, which I think is helpful and sobering. Okay, now I want to switch gears a bit. I want to talk a little bit about culture. That's one of the core theoretical contributions you argue you are making in the book. And so I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about how your views on what culture, basically your views on what culture tells us about the state in China. And I'm wondering whether, if in answering that question, it might also make sense for you to discuss a little bit what your view of culture is in the book, and how political science and law tends to view it with deep skepticism and suspicion also.
Sure. When I saw Margaret's question, I thought, hey, finally I would have to face my audience, knowing that so many people in political science, maybe in sociology, would be very skeptical about any cultural explanations. In fact, just last week, I was in Boston attending a meeting organized by the Association for Asian Studies. And there I went to a panel called The Quest of Cultural Security in Contemporary Chinese Politics. And took me a while to figure out what panelists meant by cultural security, so let me offer some background information. The Chinese authorities have always emphasized the importance of preserving China's unique culture. But it was wait until 2007, the word soft power made its way into the central government policy directives for the first time. Basically, the idea is that China, by promoting its traditional values, norms, language, culture, the Chinese government will boost its international image and gain soft power, essentially through cultural preservation and influences. And I think the most telling example is that the Chinese government has invested millions in creating Confucius Institute worldwide. So what the panelists were trying to analyze is how or what strategies the Chinese government has deployed in its effort of pursuing, soft power. As I listened to the panelists, it just hit me. Almost the moment they identified the empirical phenomenon, culture evaporated altogether in their analysis. And so this is to say that for the most part of their discussions, culture barely register as an analytical category or a conceptual framework or some sort of a theoretical perspective. So out of curiosity, I posed a question during the Q&A. And by the way, I really upset someone on the panel. She was so visibly upset. And I'll tell you who this person is. Very established scholar in Chinese politics. So I basically asked the panelist, does culture matter or not? Because if culture doesn't matter, why would researchers get together to talk about culture security, right? But on the other hand, if culture truly matters, how come panelists barely attribute any explanatory power to culture? So that was my question. And I would have to, now I would review all the panelists are political scientists. And I don't think that their indifference to culture is an isolated incident, at least my observation is in both the studies of Chinese politics and certainly in the studies of Chinese law. I've seen consistent either utter indifference or strong resistance to any sort of cultural explanation or cultural accounts. And in law schools in particular, the moment you invoke culture, people are so afraid you will be automatically guilty of cultural essentialism or cultural determinism. Anyway, what I try to do in this book is to build a dialogue between political scientists studying authoritarian regime and sociologists interested in the interplay of culture and the state. And here I should know that sociologists have not done much work in regime studies, and it is primarily political scientists who have explored the topic authoritarian resilience, basically why some authoritarian regimes have faltered and maybe even disintegrated, while others manage to become superpowers. I would say PRC is one telling example in this line. So political scientists have done a lot of work, and I don't think that's the case for sociologists, but I will argue we sociologists can make unique contribution to this conversation, to this ongoing debate among political scientists. And to this end, I have, first let me quickly identify or explain my definition by culture. I just mean a system of ideas, symbols, and practices. And in my book, I advance 3 arguments. Basically, first I argue that culture is of paramount importance to authoritarian rulers. It is critical because culture equipped China's autocrats with a toolkit for governing. Inside the toolkit, there can be miscellaneous pieces and items such as ideologies, discourses, rhetorics, narratives, and mostly policy instruments and institutional memories and principles, practices. All these elements provide the building block for autocrats to organize their perceptions and actions. I know this sounds very abstract. I will provide some concrete examples in a minute. Second, I argue that understanding ruling elites' ingenuity and agility in cultural appropriation holds the key for political scientists and sociologists to make sense of regime resilience and state capacity. Take divorce litigation as an example. These days, if you go into Chinese courts, you will see the PRCs passed side by side with legal transplants taken from Western liberal democracies. For example, to settle divorce disputes, Chinese judges continue to heavily rely on mediation and institutional practice with deep roots in the Chinese Communist Party's revolutionary past. In the meantime, judges these days can impose something called personal safety protective orders. Basically, in the American context, the equivalent is injunction order. And that's a whole new measure intended to protect victims of domestic violence. And in the PRC's history, you're not going to find that kind of practice. It was completely borrowed from countries that have long entrenched due process and rule of law. So through the study of divorce litigation, I come to discover decision makers' inventiveness and resourcefulness in deploying diverse cultural resources to tackle different kind of problems in ruling. Finally, in the book, I also argue, well, culture sometimes enables. Culture sometimes helps autocrats, but it's equally important to recognize culture can also constrain and even incapacitate autocrats' attempts at harnessing legality. Again, let me use divorce litigation as an example. I basically suggest that when you combine different cultural resources, taken, retrieved from different sources, autocrats also open themselves to contradictions and even incongruities among these elements. Time after time, Chinese judges have been told to safeguard citizens' rights to marry freely and to dissolve marriages freely because the PRC's top legislature have long enshrined individual freedoms as such. Moreover, judges have been instructed to enforce national laws to protect victims of domestic violence. In the same time, the same group of judges, according to the Chinese Communist Party and the Supreme People's Court, should contribute to a harmonious socialist society. That was a party line. By turning away divorce petitioners, by stalling marital dissolution among ordinary citizens, and by mediating marital disputes between husband and wife, even if the former is responsible for the latter's suffering. And as you can see, there are considerable tensions and contradictions among these expectations. What eventually happens in Chinese courts is that judges figure out smart ways to stay above the fray amid the information contradictions. They know there are different expectations, some from the law, the formal law, some from the party line. So judges figure out how to manipulate these issues and how to maneuver their way. It is women who make up the bulk of the divorce petition. It is women who come to shoulder the negative repercussions. In the end, among these women, very few find their courtroom experiences empowering, equitable, or fair. Many find their faith in law in tatters. So I think the key finding here is that judges figured out a way to externalize the burdens. As a result, women come to shoulder the brunt of institutional insider struggles with authoritarian legality. So ultimately, this is to say that I'm presenting a culturalist account of what makes the PRC so resilient and so adaptable. At least part of the explanation is the regime is quite resilient because it has been very, very resourceful. It figures out how to mobilize cultural resources in varied configurations to solve different problems in ruling.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to switch gears again. I want to ask you a little bit more about your fieldwork. I confess that I was hoping for a chapter at the end that delved into it more, but perhaps it's not even necessary because every page just oozes with evidence of an insight into what you were doing in the field. A couple thoughts or questions that maybe I can ask you to reflect on, and you could pick a couple. I'm mindful that we have just about 5 minutes or so before we open it up to Q&A. But for instance, sometimes in the narrative you insert yourself into it. So you're recounting a story, and then you have a quote from an informant, and then you fold in the follow-up question that you asked, for example. So I'm curious about how you think your presence in the field was viewed. In my mind, you narrated some really shocking behavior by formal legal actors. So I'm imagining situations where people just kind of forgot you were around and they forgot what your role was, or they were never even necessarily totally clear that your presence there might mean that a few years later their actions were going to be part of a narrative. So I'm just curious to get a sense of how it is that people reacted to your presence in the field. And if you have a bit of time, I'm quite curious to hear about what you think it might be like if you were doing this research nowadays when the climate is quite different and there's just a lot of discussion about how difficult it is to do more in-depth ethnographic fieldwork in the country.
Sure. Earlier today, Margaret and I had lunch together, and during lunch we talked a lot about ethnographic research because we both are ethnographers. And we both conduct field work in contexts where you don't really know where the red line lies. What is permissible, what is not permissible, it's not always clear, not to mention, last time I was in the field was summer 2018. What about you? When was the last time you did your field work?
2016.
Okay, a lot have changed since then. The pandemic, rising tensions between US and China, not to mention under Xi Jinping's watch, a lot of issues. Previously, issues considered safe, now become super sensitive. So I have to say that these days I have a lot on my mind. Why did this project, the project on divorce litigation, I was lucky because back then around 2006, 2010, rural women's struggle of divorce was hardly a political matter. In fact, people in the field took me by and large for granted. And I was able to achieve that in part because I conducted 3 waves of preliminary field work between 2006 and 2008. So it took me a long time to build ties with the key players in the field. And also, in hindsight, I was quite effective in identifying potential allies in the field. By allies, I mean the underdogs in the grassroots court system. I mostly approached a group of legal workers in the countryside. They were underdogs in the sense that they made a living by providing villagers with legal services. So they were market players. At the same time, for those who study China, it's pretty well known that the legal profession in China has been systematically subordinate to the state. So these legal workers were really unhappy about their experience in court. They were hardly on par with judges, this is to say. So I knew that these legal workers were very bitter, unhappy, and I knew they were looking for sympathetic ears. I managed to establish relationship with 2 legal workers' office and their connections with other actors, judges, court clerks, village cadres, government officials. Their connection with political elites opened the door for me. So later I could interview litigants, I could interview judges and court clerks. So to a certain degree, I was quite effective, but despite all the preparations I just mentioned, I experienced persistent resistance from judges. So many times judges shut the door to my face. So many times judges told me, get out. I don't want you to observe this mediation session. So many times judges simply pretended that I did not exist. There was one female judge. I spent months in her tribunal, and all this time, not even once, she greeted me with a hello, ni hao. No, she just pretended that I did not exist at all. And by the way, that's why in the writing, I was not entirely kind to her either. So I was like, hey, this is my only way to get back this person. But long story short, basically, I don't have really well-made, ready-made answer to you. And in a week or later, in a week or so, I will fly to my research site in China. And once I land in Chengdu, that's my research site in southwest China, soon I will be interviewed by a Chinese journalist. And recently, this journalist emailed me out of blue. This is someone who works for the T magazine. I don't know if you are aware of this magazine. It's actually a publication affiliated with the New York Times. And the T magazine has a Chinese branch, published in mainland China, based in mainland China, and it will be the first time for me to sit down with a Chinese journalist. And by the way, this journalist clearly has done his homework. He sent me 18 interview questions. He read my book. He went to the Chinese feminism. This is a forum for feminist activists. Last summer, I gave a talk there. And he also went to the University of Hong Kong. I gave a talk last year, and he watched the recording. So he did his homework. And I expect once he and I sit down, I will talk about my research. And now these days, I constantly think about what I should say, what I should stay away. And my mother is so worried. My mother doesn't want me to have anything to do with journalists. But I showed my mother a cover of the magazine, and on that particular cover, the magazine features a famous Chinese actress, Zhang Ziyi. And I was like, Mom, this is a journal, this is a magazine that will publish my research. I'm going to be a celebrity just like her. Anyway, my point is, yes, there are just so many uncertainties in field work.
Yeah.
Okay, so 3 minutes past the point.
Let's open it up to questions. I had a couple other questions, but maybe someone in the audience will pick up on it, and if I have an extra time, I will insert myself into the Q&A as well. So, and I'll be monitoring the questions on the Zoom link as well. So, open opening it up to Q&A. Oh.
Thanks so much, Ke. This was amazing, and congratulations on your book. It's a huge accomplishment. I have, I guess, two questions. One, I'm thinking of the work of Stephanie Coontz, the American marriage historian, and she's often written about how we think about this golden age of marriage, and then she actually documents there never was one. Marriage has always changed. So I guess my one question is there similar discourse in China now that there was once this golden age of marriage and now we are not there anymore? And my second question, which I think you were getting to a little bit, is there now a divorce industry in China similar to here? You mentioned legal workers, but is divorce law big business like it is here? Too?
Yes, thank you for your question. Both are very interesting. Was there ever a golden age of marriage? I would say for my parents' generation, and maybe for my sister's generation, they certainly harbor some memories of that golden age, but to what extent their memories reflect reality, and to what extent it's just based on pure imagination, that's a different matter. But definitely, one of my favorite Chinese TV drama is called The Love Story of Our Parents, and very much speaks to that imagined past. Our parents had perfect marriage. Nowadays, not anymore. And as for divorce industry, that's a really good question. And I did my field work in rural China. So in the countryside, legal workers, and they're different from lawyers. They have less formal education. They cannot represent clients in criminal cases. So these individuals primarily relied on divorce cases as their major source of income. So in that sense, yes, there is definitely a divorce-based legal service industry, and I should say that they charge a lot of monies. So for a single case, they could charge anywhere between a few hundred to 3,000 yuan. And most of the women in my study, their monthly salary was barely 1,000 yuan. So this is to say that just to cover legal service. I'm not even talking about litigation fee charged by the court. I'm not talking about travel expenses. I'm just talking about legal service fee. It could cost you 3 months of your salary. And in urban China, this could be worse.
Congratulations, Ke. It's great to see this book out in the world. I have two questions that are tied to the two classes of students I have here today. There's some students from the capstone, which I know you teach a lot, and I'm sure they'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about your interviews. You're interviewing women about very difficult stories, very private and painful stories. So I'm wondering if you could say a little more about your techniques in terms of when to push more or when to hold back, how you sort of navigated that in your interviews, which I know is something our students are concerned about. And the other class I'm teaching, on Wednesday, we're going to start learning about authoritarian legality. So I'd like to hear you say a little more directly sort of how you see the literature on authoritarian legality, how it treats it, and what you think you're doing differently in the book around this concept.
Sure. So the first question is about techniques in interviews. And when I first entered the field, it was so clear to me that I didn't even have the vocabulary. Because in my mind, back then I was a graduate student, I thought about law in terms of all these technical and conceptual terms, such as legal consciousness, right? And when you pose a question, tell me a bit about your legal consciousness. And of course, the women in my study stared at me as if I were from Mars. So it took me a very, very long time to figure out I must learn their language. I must learn from them. So let me give you one concrete example. In my interviews, women complained about money all the time. At first, I was under the impression they talk about money all the time because these were really poor women, right? And it was after a while I realized that behind their talk of money was something else. They use money as a symbol, as indicator of love, trust, and many other different issues. So all in all, this is to say that when you do interviews, you need to immerse yourself in the world, and when you understand whatever language people use, whatever vocabularies they use, when you understand what exactly these terms, languages mean, you will have a better sense of how to pose your interview questions. And as for the literature on authoritarian legality, I recently made a podcast with Nick Cheeseman, a political scientist in Australia. And in that conversation, I basically argue that political scientists, those who study authoritarian law and courts in authoritarian context, are so stuck in functionalism and in rational choice theories. And I was like, both political scientists and sociologists have long critiqued these two theoretical orientations. They're hardly new. And in fact, I would go as far as to argue the literature offers some low-hanging fruits in the sense that you want to figure out how to create this literature, just take a look at how sociologists, political scientists have criticized rational choice theory and functionalism. You will figure out what's wrong with the literature. Neither rational choice theory or functionalism are particularly, neither of these two is particularly sensitive to culture and history. And that's precisely why in my book I decided I'm gonna formulate a historically charged culturalist approach. So I would say, I hope my critique of this literature is very pointed and precise.
Hi, Ke.
Yeah,
Thanks so
sure.
much for this. Really appreciate your coming in to do this talk for OAR. So I have a question, really from this cultural perspective, and my apologies if this was covered before I came in or if it's outside your scope, but I'm wondering about stigma attached to essentially being a divorced woman, particularly in a rural context. Is there a social ostracism or social isolation that comes along with that? And then particularly in the context of the sort of coming demographic winter, if that's leading to a lot of sort of severance of parent-child relationships for these women, does that have the risk of essentially leading to cumulative disadvantage when these women are in that older 65 and over cohort?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. Stigma. And so in the first chapter, I had one chapter explicitly about extramarital affairs, because among the 32 women I interviewed, 8 of them divulged to me that before they finalized their divorce, they had developed intimate relationship with other men. Essentially, they had marital affairs, right? And so the popular or the conventional wisdom in China right now, both in urban China and in rural China, is Chinese marriage has become so fragile, so volatile, precisely because these days so many people are engaging in extramarital affairs. And in the book, I basically argue that's a very flawed view. The women in my study, they had to develop some intimate relationship because they were acutely aware of the structural disadvantages. Once these rural women got divorced, they would immediately lose access to farmland. And these women would not be able to secure livelihood by working as migrant laborers in cities. So this is to say that women in my study very much see marriage as some sort of safety net. So this is to say why a lot of them, while they work as migrant workers in faraway cities, either out of loneliness, out of social isolation, developed extramarital relationships, or because they were quite aware once they got divorced, they would have to figure out a way to attach themselves with another rural household, basically to re-access farmland. And of course, there were other speculations, social stigma, for example, judges and legal professionals often speculated that migrant women made money because they worked as sex workers, and that's what Margaret studied. And the idea that women, in order to accumulate financial resources, many engage in prostitution, that was a widespread stereotype in the countryside. And that's why when I ask women how they manage to finance their divorce litigation, oftentimes women would be very careful. They would frame their words, making sure that they would not leave me with the impression somehow they were working as prostitutes. So, but I don't think this is the case in urban China anymore, because divorce, as I mentioned earlier today, is so widespread.
I'm going to hop in with a question from the Zoom chat. So this is from Alexandra. You mentioned how contemporary China exercised control among women especially. Do you believe the government attempts to subdue women's voices because they may be fearful of the power their words may have in empowering even more Chinese women to divorce their husbands?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking that, Alexandra. Feminist movement or the Me Too movement has certainly gained traction in mainland China. And during the most recent so-called white paper revolution, basically Chinese citizens took to the street to protest the zero COVID policy, right? And in that movement, there were a lot of female students. Basically, these were college students who were so brave, and they stepped forward and protested, and by now I believe 11 of them have been arrested. We don't even know where these individuals are. So yes, I would say in recent years, especially since 2015, the feminist groups in mainland China have increasingly faced scrutiny, surveillance, and outright repressions from the Chinese government. Would you like to go?
Go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk. As you mentioned that you worked with rural women living in rural areas or from rural areas, it reminded me of the incident in Xuzhou, which was hotly debated in the past year, in which a woman was suspected to be trafficked to a family and forced to be married and give birth to 8 children, and was kept in a very bad situation. So I'm wondering, through your research on marriage and divorce, how would you understand such incidences that involves undocumentation and human trafficking, and what we can do to change it? And relatedly, I'm also wondering, what do you think is the role of public discussions and discussions on social media in changing the legal system of marriage as well, like for this incident and the marriage law in general?
Sure. Let me first comment on your first question. What happened in Xuzhou, by the way, that was a city in northeast China. What happened was a woman who later was identified as a victim of human trafficking. She was forced into a marriage and then gave birth to 8 children. And when journalists spotted her, she was chained by a iron line, and it was just pretty horrific. And by the way, in my field work, I've seen plenty of evidence of similar human trafficking in rural Sichuan province. And I think it's important to illuminate the context why human trafficking is so rampant, in part because the combination of China's one-child policy and this entrenched cultural preference for son over daughters. The combination of these two has created the worst, the highly twisted sex ratios in China. So this is to say that over time, China has produced so many boys, but not enough girls. So I believe the estimate is by 2025, China would have roughly 30 million more men than women. And pretty much every single village I visited, villagers told me we have so many single men in their 30s, in their 40s, they just couldn't find any wives. And when you couldn't find, and women's participation in labor out migration had further exacerbated this problem. So this is why human trafficking is so rampant, because there is a black market for it. As for your second question, I'm still grappling with that, right? What kind of lawmaking or what kind of legal practices can change? And what I can say at this point is state law, as much as it is part of the solution right now, it is part of the problem, right? Because I've seen how legal mobilization and litigation, rather than fixing problem, judges, legal workers have created more problems. So I don't think there is a very easy answer to the question. And I did notice last year when the National People's Congress amended the law on the protection of women's rights and interests, lawmakers put in place some measures against human trafficking, against sexual harassment. That's another rampant problem in the workplace in China. So let me put it this way. If you only look at the law on the books, the PRC is not bad at all. It has put in place a lot of progressive legal rules. The bigger problem, or the more pertinent question, is how come law in reality all too often does not live up to the one on the books?
I would first like to say congratulations on the book, and also thank you for bringing this issue to the surface because it's really important. My first question is in reference to the cooling off period on the divorce. That's to slow down the process of divorce. I was wondering, say there's a woman in like a really unsafe situation like domestic violence. Could she be granted her divorce to be finalized faster? And the second part of my question is, if there is the cooling off period that takes too long, does it cause people to kind of resist in a way of having an idea of creating like a under the table type of divorce finalizing process? Or do they just respect what the PRC is saying, that you have to wait?
Yeah, both are really good questions. And I totally agree with you. Cooling off period can make women even more, especially victims of domestic violence, right? Even more vulnerable at home, because when you try to get out of very abusive relationship and courts ask you to wait and wait and wait, it's not really very helpful. So that's exactly what I argue in the book. And your second question is also quite interesting. A lot of the women in my book, they didn't have a legal divorce because a lot of them didn't know how to use the court system to get a legal divorce, or they didn't have the money to pay for divorce litigation. So what they did, for lack of a better word, I would say they had some sort of de facto divorce, meaning that they just didn't go back to their conjugal families. They disappeared in the cities. For years, they didn't contact their husband. For years, they didn't even visit their own children in the countryside. And that's why in Chinese courts, there's one particular type of divorce. Oftentimes, when a wife is absent for so many years, then the husband will go to the court and say, I want a divorce. But the plaintiff or the defendant is absent. What do you do? So the judge will publish some sort of message in a newspaper and say, so-and-so, your husband just sued you. If you don't show up, we are going to adjudicate. And that type of divorce is so common in the countryside, precisely because women figured out, hey, you know what? You're not going to terminate my marriage? Fine. I'm not going to, deliver my responsibility as a wife or even as a mother. So I should quickly note, I've seen statistics for the past 3 years, and I've seen once the civil code became effective, divorce rates went down like this. But right now, we cannot really tell to what extent this decline is a result of the COVID, zero COVID policy, because during the zero COVID policy, people couldn't even leave their apartment or their neighborhood. Or is it because once the civil code made divorce even harder, now people would have to stay away from courts or local governments?
Congratulations on your book, and thanks for presenting your thoughts today. The question I have, earlier you mentioned that there's a choice that the divorce can be registered if there's an agreement on the separation of property, or it can be taken to court. What explains that, especially from the perspective of the woman who is not going to get the protection in court? And so how does that decision play out? Who contributes to that? Are legal professionals involved in that process as well?
Yeah. So are you asking how people weigh their options?
Right. And what contributes to those decisions?
That's a really good question. And I would say that's definitely one of the limitations of my work, because I only studied people who eventually landed in courtrooms, right? Had I also interviewed couples who picked a different route, maybe I would be in a better position to address that question. Right now, what I can immediately say is that the women in my study, a lot of them had no prior contact with the court system. And precisely because they had no contact with the court system, at the beginning of their divorce litigations, they were very optimistic. They really bought into the state's propaganda. The court will be very fair, and judges will be impartial, and because the Chinese government has put a lot of propaganda out there saying the court system is all great. So women bought into that narrative. And of course, once they started the process, they realized that's not the case.
Oh, Jesus. My question is, where can we find your book? If there's like any publishing websites, or is it on Amazon?
It is on Amazon.
There's another question I'll bring up from Zoom. So from Amanda G, were you ever in fear that something may happen to you as you started publicly discussing these inequalities and coming out with your book? I'm curious, especially to how you had mentioned how some of the judges and officials were treating you in a rude manner. I suppose that's why your mother is concerned also with your upcoming interview.
Yeah, let me take a look. This is a question?
Yeah.
Okay. So when I did the field work between 2006 and 2011, I was not particularly worried about my personal safety, but there was one instant. It was very memorable. I was approaching a husband hoping that he could talk to me, and he was mad and upset. So for a moment, I was a bit concerned about my safety. But other than that, I really didn't worry that much. At least I was not worried about the husband in my study. What I was concerned is when I showed up in the countryside, sometimes village cadres or local government officials mistook me for some sort of journalist, because I was going around asking questions, and there was a lot of illegal administrative activities in the countryside. For example, illegal land taking, corruption, all other sorts of problems. And so local political elites, police, government officials were so afraid that if I were a journalist, I could potentially expose them. So this is to say that I was not afraid of the man or the husband in my study. I was mostly concerned how the local government would see me. So that was my main concern back then. And now, 10 days later, I will go back to China to study LGBTQ-initiated litigation and legal advocacy. And very soon I'm going to be constantly think about national security and public security. So folks from these two big departments. Last year, my collaborator, she's a law professor, she works for a Chinese university. Over the years, she has been involved in multiple NGO groups. And she suddenly contacted me saying that I'm so concerned because she was going to the US consulate in Chengdu to attend an event. And she basically enrolled in the program, hoping that she could speak up at that forum. Out of nowhere, national security contact her saying, contact her, asking her, what exactly you're going to do at that event? She really freaked out, and her interpretation is she was almost certain that the U.S. consulate in Chengdu was there was surveillance on the consulate. That's how the national security find out her involvement at that event. So, yeah, that's something I would have to think about all the time.
Oh. I want to say thank you for giving us your insight on the book. I'm curious to know, did you interview women of all ages or just a particular age did you focus on?
Yeah, the women in my study range from the early 20s all the way to those in their 60s. Are we? Oh. Okay, Dan, we're around that time.
So we are closing. Sorry, I'm Dan Stageman. I am the Director of Research in the Office for the Advancement of Research and the sponsor of this event. And I would just like to thank Dr. Lee and Dr. Boateng. That was what I was going for, but I just wanted to make sure. And thank you all for coming this evening. We have a couple more talks. I know that Remy mentioned them, but we've been doing this for a while, and we're very glad this year to get back to some in-person events. And we really appreciate our speakers today. So let's give them a round of applause.